Hello everyone. So this time around we're going to actually be working with Unreal Engine. We're not just going to be clicking at the launcher, and I'm going to have to make sure that you've downloaded your assets for this section. I've pre-created a project that's already got some things in it for us. It's called ArcViz Demo, and I'm going to need you to open that up and double click on the U project file. Okay, and upon doing so you'll be greeted with this. Now, once you've opened it for the first time, it will now appear inside of your launcher and you can open it any stage after that. But for the very first time you load it, you're going to need to either launch the engine and then select it, or straight up double click on the U project file. Now, once you're in, you'll be greeted with this. And this is your first introduction to Unreal Engine. So to begin with, we're going to cover some of the basics. To move around the viewport, I can use my mouse and I can hold right click and move my mouse. And while doing this, this allows me to look around the viewport. While holding right click, I'm actually also able to use W, A, S, and D, so standard first person controls, to move around like this as well. You can use Q and you can use E while holding right click to also jump up and down. Now, if you don't want to use your keyboard as well, you can use your left click to move around the viewport like this. You'll notice that as I rotate left, it moves left, and as I rotate right, it moves right. And if I hold both at the same time, I'm able to move directly up and directly down, or directly left and directly right. So that's how you can have up, down, strafe left, and strafe right going on. Now, within this viewport, we've got a couple of things, but there's really not much there. But that's okay. So to begin with, what we've got is this little icon in the middle. If I click on this, I can see that up top here, this comes to life and selects the icon. And that's because this section in the top right is the world outliner. So anything that is currently in my environment is automatically selected within the world outliner. If I was to click on the light source, I would see that this has now been selected as well. If I click down here, I would be able to select my atmospheric fog. Now, whenever I click on something, you'll see that a couple of other things pop up. First off is this widget. We've got up, right, and forward. And these represent the three axes of movement. We have x-axes, y-axes, and z-axes. So red refers to x-axes, green refers to as y-axes, and blue is the z-axes. Now, when I select any of these things, I'm able to move the object along that axis. If I click there, I can now move it. And of course, if I click here, I'm able to shift it as well. So, some very basic stuff, but if I was to select this button up here, or alternatively hit the space bar, it'll cycle widgets, and I now get a rotation widget. And again, if I was to grab this, I'm able to rotate it. Now, some people might be confused as to why the colors seem different. Before, blue, or Z, was pointing upwards, but it's not anymore. The reason for that is this represents rotation, and rotation is actually spinning around the axes. So the best way to visualize that is if I go back to this, you can see that the blue axis points up, and therefore, when I rotate, I'm spinning around that up arrow. And this is how I can use this to spin in various different ways, and we can put the object in any position that we want to. Now, the final one that we get is scale, and if I click this, I'm able to scale. And this just makes it bigger or smaller, and increases. Now, I'm sure you've noticed as I've been doing this, that my numbers in the right-hand side over here are reflecting the changes that I'm making. If I was to move this up, I can see that my location has changed to 272 on the z-axis. If I move it down, 122. Now, at any stage, if you move something up and you want it to fall to the ground, you can press the end key and it will automatically drop to the ground. So the reason I brought these up is because this is the details panel. The details panel represents your basic attributes for any item. If I was to click on this light, I can now see that I have the ability to affect just how bright it is in the world. If I was to click on the player start here, you can see that there's not too many things that I can change by default, but I am still able to custom set the z-axis, for instance, and set its position in the world. I might also want to rotate it and have it facing that way. So I can just punch in those things directly and will automatically be set. Again, you can press End to drop it to the ground. So with that in mind, I'm going to actually go ahead and start making some changes here. I'm going to first off go to this section over here. Now this is the Modes panel. Within the Modes panel, we have access to a variety of different tools. We have Place, Paint, Landscape, Foliage, and Geometry Editing. So for this section, we're primarily going to be working with the geometry tools and the placement tools, and we'll leave the others for later. Now, for this first project, what I'm going to want you to do is click on this button down here that says Geometry. Upon doing so, you'll be greeted by these things here. This allows me to make a box brush, a cone brush, cylinder, stairs, or sphere. Now what that means is if I was to get this box and left click and drag it into the world, I can see that it's now in the world. Now the reason I want you to know how to do this is that, first off, I can see there are some attributes over here. If I was to punch in 400, it's automatically stretched this box out along that x-axis. At any stage you can click this little yellow arrow and it will reset it to the default values. Now there's another way to modify this, and this is, in my opinion, the far more useful way, and that is you can go to Geometry Editing mode. When I click on Geometry Editing mode, you'll see each face is now turned blue, and the reason for that is I'm now able to click on a face and just drag it out. Click and drag. So with that in mind, we're now able to see that we can construct some things. But I'm sure many of you are going, well, so what? You're just resizing a box. Well, that's fine. Let's click here. And this time I'm going to go and click on Extrude. You're going to get a warning the first time this happens that warns you that extrusions only happen in local coordinate systems. And that's fine. Just click Don't Show Me this again. What that warning is essentially telling you is that when you pull out a face, you're pulling them in local space, not in world space, which means forward is relative to the angle that the surface was currently facing. I'll get more on this later. So if I was to hold down Extrude and I was to click here and drag out, you'll notice something different happened. And what happened is that this time, instead of stretching the face to that location, what it did instead was it extended a new set of vertices, which are these corner points, out to that location and added some new faces in. So these can be selected now independently of one another. I'm able to click here and drag upwards. And you can see once again it's extended out. And if I was to click here, again. Now, the reason I brought this up is that I'm going to go back to edit mode, clicking on here, and I'm just going to really quickly select these. And to do that, I clicked on one, I held Control and left clicked on the other. And what that did is instead of selecting the faces, it just grabbed those 2 points. The reason that's useful is that if I was to pull this out, you can see that we can now get an angled brush. Now, we can do more than just adding these things. I'm going to drag in a new thing, and to do that, I'm going to go to Place. And this time, for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to go Geometry, and I'm going to drop in a sphere. Now this sphere, I'm going to overlap with our geometry just here. And at the moment you can see that we have, not the best sphere, but it's a good start. I'm going to increase the tessellation here, just to make something that's a little more rounded. But I'm also going to click here. See where it says additive? I'm going to change that to subtractive. Now if I click off that object, you can now see that what it's done has carved out our geometry. So this initial process of carving out geometry is very, very useful because it allows you to very quickly set something up. Now, I know it's very unlikely that in your game you're going to have a giant sea to carve out, but a good example would be I could easily build a bridge and carve out a tunnel in it. So I want you to go ahead and do that. Now, one quick thing that's going to have happened, when I deleted the box, I can no longer see the sphere. I know it's still there, but I can't see it. Now there are two ways to go about handling this situation. I could click here on the sphere brush, which is in my world outliner that I showed you before, or alternatively, I'm actually able to go up to the top here and see where it says lit. I can change that to wireframe. Now you'll notice that next to each of these is an Alt key, Alt 4, 3, 2, 5, and 6. If I was to press Alt 2, it would do the same thing as selecting it here. it's a really quick shortcut for you to move between modes. So I'm going to click wireframe, at which point we can now see the world represented as a wireframe. I can now actually just click on the object directly, and I can hit delete. To go back to it just then, I hit Alt 4. If you don't want to do that, you can always go here and click on lit. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to quickly make myself a bridge or a walkway for someone to go along. Now I want to point out at this point that when I drop this in, it's not exactly cleanly snapping to the grid. When I drop in the box, it's moving not comfortably around this area. I really would like it snapping to these squares. Now the reason it's not doing that is up here. See this section that says set position grid snap? I'm going to click on that. I'm going to go down and set it to a grid size of 100. Now these units are in Unreal units, but Unreal units are directly proportional to centimeters. So 100 means 100 centimeters. If I click on that and I drag in a box, you can now see that it's perfectly snapped to these grid tiles, and if I was to move it, it would automatically snap to the next tile. Now for this bridge, I'm going to put this here, I'm going to set it up, I'm going to quickly just extend this across. So I'm going to go back to geometry mode. And you can move between these modes with Shift 1 and Shift 5 as a shortcut. So I'm going to click there, I'm going to extend it to 2 blocks beforehand. Oops, I wasn't in extrude mode. So I'm going to click here and go to extrude mode. I'm going to pull out one more time. And now I'm going to put this to here. And on this side, I'm going to pull this out to here. Now I've got this shape going on. What I'm going to do at this point is go back to my geometry tools, and I'm going to add myself a staircase. So I'm going to drag in a linear staircase, and you'll see that it just looks like this. You can set the number of steps, you can set the height of each step, etc., to be whatever you desire. But in this case, I think the defaults are actually probably good. So I've added a staircase there. Now I'm going to add another one over here. And while I could just drag in a staircase again, what I want to actually do instead is hold down the Alt key and drag. So while holding Alt and dragging, I end up over here. And it duplicates the object automatically. Do you see that? I'm now going to hit spacebar, and I'm going to rotate it around 180 degrees on the Z-axis. Spacebar, spacebar, and I'm going to set this up so that it's the same on either side. Now the final thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to get a cylinder. I'm going to drop that in, I'm going to hit the spacebar, and I'm going to rotate my cylinder this way. Now the reason for that is this cylinder is going to end up being the guts of my bridge. So I'm going to put this here, at which points I'm going to lower it down. Now, if I was to click here and go to subtractive, we would carve out something that looked like this. Now, that works, except that you've got the world's worst bridge. So instead, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get my cylinder brush. To get that just then, I clicked in the world outliner. Again, if you want to be able to select it, you can hit Alt 2 to go to wireframe mode, and then you can just click on the brush. If things are getting complicated and you don't want to see things in your scene, you can always click on them and hit H to hide them. So I'm going to click on the floor and hit H to hide it. Now, if you want them back, you can hit Control H and they'll come back into the world. But this is a nice way to quickly just focus on some of the things that you actually care about. So I've got this, and I can see that where it subtracts geometry runs flush with the top here. Now this is one of those instances where what I would actually suggest you do is I'm going to go back to my grid size, and I'm going to set it to 10 centimeters instead of 100. And by doing that, I'm now able to move this down exactly 10 centimeters. I'm also going to set this back to 100 now, because I really want to make sure that everything that I'm doing predominantly stays on the grid. Now I've gone back to my view and I can't see the sky dome and I can't see the floor. And the reason for that is that I've still got them hidden. So I can hit Control H and they'll pop back. But most importantly, what I've done right now is we've created ourselves a nice bridge. And if I was to hit play, I will now be a floating thing. And if I run into this surface, it's not going to let me pass. But if I want to go under the bridge, no worries. Now these tools are used primarily for just blocking out the environment. You really don't want to rely on having too many of these in your final piece. Typically what happens is you block out your geometry this way, and then you'll go back later and convert them to static meshes to make them more efficient. Now that we've covered geometry tools, we're going to be looking at static mesh placement in the next section.